Let me talk about the mandate for a minute, because this is going to be one of those things that we're going to have to work on and try to minimize the confusion around it. So if you recall, I mentioned that the mandate is supposed to take effect for 2011 for everybody. We actually are planning to phase it in over 2 years. So next year, for people who prepare 100 or more returns, the e-file mandate will take effect. That turns out to be probably a large bulk of people who prepare large amounts of returns. We anticipate somewhere around 30,000 additional EROs will come into the system just to get us to 100. We're going to give everyone else, those who file under 100 and more than 10, 1 more year until 2011 to comply with the mandate. We actually anticipate 65,000 more EROs coming in the next year. In other words, there'll be a lot more people, but a lot fewer returns, as they'll all be preparing less than 100 returns. We are also going to maintain the current structure of the EFIN at the firm level. The reason for that, at least initially, is that that will drive electronic filing. So imagine a firm with 5 tax return preparers, each of whom has a PTIN, but each of whom only does 9 returns, or 9 returns that are actually subject to the e-file mandate. There may be some exceptions, for example, religious exception or other things. If the mandate were at the PTIN level, not one of those return preparers would have to file electronically. But if the mandate is at the firm level, if the EFIN is there, all of them will file electronically. And so we intend to maintain that system because we want to continue to drive electronic filing. We also think we can't change the system that exists for EFINs and implement a new PTIN system and implement regulation all at the same time because there are way too many moving parts. So we're going to keep that in place. We figure the big guys should be able to comply by 2011. We will have exemptions and waiver processes in place so that folks who have problems, maybe there are hardship issues or other things, will have the ability to obtain some relief. What we're not going to let happen is someone who has 40 or 50 taxpayers who all on their own decide to opt out of the system for no apparent reason. That will not be something we're going to let happen. There has to be some middle ground here. One of the other things that I've not talked about that I suspect you at least thought about, since I've mentioned religious exceptions a couple of times, is that this process, the e-file process, requires that you have a Social Security number. Now, we are imposing an e-filing mandate that says nothing about the presence of a Social Security number, meaning the Amish and foreign preparers who don't have SSNs have to have a way of getting into the system. And so we are trying to figure out how we link that up to the PTIN system. And I'll be honest with you, it's not an easy task. How do you get any sense of security around someone who prepares returns overseas or someone about whom you have little information but has a religious exception? So what we're likely to use is an existing process. I can't guarantee it, but you may have heard of the ITIN process. It may be the only thing that we have to enable us to track and register foreign preparers and folks with religious exemptions, because they will be part of our tax ecosystem. They are today, and we do not have any intention of depriving them of their own business because of our rules. I think I mentioned this, but just to stress it again, there are a number of members on the Hill who have pieces of legislation that would regulate in one form or another tax return preparers. But you'll notice the IRS does not require legislation to do this. And that's because, as I was saying before, what we're doing is using the Circular 230 rules under Title 31 of the U.S. Code to redefine practice before the IRS. And in doing so, we are able to bring tax return preparation under that umbrella and impose rules around it. That means everybody will have to follow the Circular 230 ethical standards. Now, I do believe that there'll be a large group of people who come in and who want to do this. I also believe there are a lot of folks in that gray area who are going to be kind of, I'm not sure whether I want to do this or not. We have some strategies for convincing them. One is to make this a professional organization at some level, to professionalize an industry that hasn't been. A second is to drive consumers to demand it. Demand some kind of IRS imprimatur from people who are preparing tax returns. That I still believe a lot of return preparers will go underground. In other words, they won't sign the returns. They'll just say to their clients, here, go ahead, you don't need to have me sign it. And there are a lot of taxpayers who are going to stay underground because they don't want to be part of the system either. Don't have an easy solution to that, but our focus is on those people who are playing to make sure that they understand what the ethical standards are. And I need your help in that because you guys have already been down that road. So I'm very interested in thinking about how we message that. We have to have a comprehensive compliance and enforcement strategy. So compliance in terms of people who are registering to prepare tax returns. So I mentioned the automatic checks that we'll do. But also, more broadly, all those people in that gray and black market area, how do we move them into the system or deal with them if they stay out? I don't have the answers to those questions, but I think that's going to be one of our biggest challenges. At the end of the day, we'll open the doors, we'll have the system, everybody has a P10, everybody's taken the exam, everybody's an EA or a CPA or something, and then the question becomes, what is the IRS doing about all those other people who are not? So here's a simple one. What if we get a tax return with an invalid P10? What should we do? Reject the return? There are a number of people who say, oh, just go ahead and reject the return. I'll tell you, I don't think, at least initially, we can put the burden on the taxpayer to deal with the fact that the tax return preparer doesn't have a valid P10. Maybe several years into this program, we start doing that. But we have to have what I'll call a set of graduated touches that are designed to encourage people to comply before we bring the hammer down. Because if we pull a P10, we're essentially saying you are not allowed to prepare tax returns for money. Now, that doesn't mean they won't do it, but we're actually pulling something that affects their livelihood. So maybe the first thing that happens is we send a letter to the return preparer and to the taxpayer, by the way, because we want to drive that consumer behavior that says, hey, you use someone who is not registered with the IRS. And here's what that means. And you need to be, and to the preparer, you need to be registered with the IRS. You need to either take the exam, or become an enrolled agent, or a CPA, or a lawyer. One of those things. Maybe then it's a visit. And then maybe it's a due process in which we end up pulling the P10 and telling them that they're barred from practice, period. But it has to be graduated. And it has to be graduated not only because we need to offer due process, but also it gets very expensive very quickly when you're looking at the volumes we're talking about. We want to utilize the limited resources we have as most effectively as we can. The public awareness campaign is one of the places where I want to work with you all very closely to be able to distinguish the EA brand as a separate brand from a registered return preparer. You will also be able to take the designation registered return preparer, but there are things that EAs can do that a registered return preparer can't. And so we need to build that brand awareness, and we need to think about how we do that and define a niche in the marketplace that is different. And it will matter because of the last thing, which you'll see is this creation of a public database. At some point, and I'm not going to commit to the time frames because this one's really going to be hard. The ideal vision here is that we'll have a website on we'll have a site on irs.gov that will enable people to look up a potential return preparer. I want to go see Bob. I see him hanging out there. Is he registered with the IRS, and what are his credentials? And I would like to be able to say Bob is an enrolled agent who's practiced for X number of years, some sort of almost a Facebook kind of profile. But what are the odds that any system that has 1 million names and all the data associated with them will be right at any given point in time? I'll tell you there's 0. Even 10 names is a problem, but 1 million, 0. So one of the things, not only do we can build this thing at some point, but what we have to have are exception processes. So when Bob is sitting there in his office and he's wondering why no one's coming in, and he calls one of his old clients and she says, well, I looked you up, you're not on the IRS website says you're not registered. Bob has to be able to resolve that quickly because that's Bob's business at stake, right? So we've got to be, we, the IRS, have to have a process in place that allows Bob to resolve it quickly. And you know how good we are at resolving problems quickly.